Thank you for staying with us here on PM Express. As you know, this is an election year, but there is an economy that is still in crisis, as you know. And we are an IMF program. And in the last few days, there have been some good news because we reached some form of agreement in principle with our external bilateral creditors. But that doesn't tell the whole story because, as you know, we are in an election year. We are under an IMF program. We're going to look at the prospects. And this is looking really into the crystal ball. In election years, a lot happened. And I'm delighted that we'll be joined by the last finance minister to supervise an economy, which was also in dire straits at the time, not as serious as now, though, while also navigating a period of elections. And that's him, is Tekpe. I'm really looking forward to talking to him. Yes, Mr. Tekpe, great to have you join us. And the reason why I brought him in, because I am very curious to learn from him. If you are a finance minister in an election year with an IMF in town and an IMF program, your government wants to win the elections. That is fundamental. So the IMF too wants to make sure that you comply with the program dictates. How do you juggle both to ensure that you keep the economy afloat and meet the requirements that the IMF will impose on you, but also at the same time, also satisfy the cravings of your own government, of your own party as a finance minister? It is not a place I want to be, and I don't really envy the finance minister. The only person who's been there, at least that we know, in the last, two election cycles, is Tekpe. He was there in 2016, similar circumstances, not as dire. I will ask him that question. I want him to share that with me first. Well, how did he manage that? And then we'll get into the specifics. But there are a few things to clear. There's a few house rules to clear before we can get into those details. And one of the things I want to quickly do in examining this here is the subject of the IMF program and where we are with our debt restructuring. As we know, this is what we want to do with our external debt. It's fundamentally about that, right? We have 30 billion total external debt, out of which 20 billion is earmarked for restructuring. So this is what we're focusing on right now. And as you've seen, we've had a great conversation with our external bilateral debt holders, and this is 5.4 billion. It's just a debt moratorium. It's very important. What it means in essence is that this deal we've struck with China and others, it's not as if they are forgiving us our debt. They're simply saying, pay it later. And from the conversations we've had, it is 7 years. Remember that this will have to track back, though, to 2021, which means in essence, we have 4 more years before we begin to pay what we owe. So what in essence has happened is that whoever wins the 2024 elections this year would have some 3 years within which you will not pay. But in your final year, in 2028, you'll have to begin to have the conversation around going back to pay. So we have kicked the can down the line, but it gives us breathing space. So that is debt moratorium of $5.4 billion. But then once we clear this hurdle, and there's a lot of conversations still to be had here, this 5.4 billion, the question is, are we going to get all of this? Because of course, each country will have to now begin to have conversations with China in particular and others to say, we owe you X amount. And China is one of the biggest, countries we owe. What do you want to do for us on there? We want to possibly have in there some form of an arrangement that also says that interest will also be forgiven. So that's a big conversation. But the more complex one is what we're going to have with our commercial creditors, which is the Eurobond holders, right, of 14.6 billion. That's the biggest chunk of the debt. And as you see, it's the proposal. The last time we spoke to the Deputy Finance Minister way back, he had given us a sense that they will propose a 30% haircut. But some have said it could be as high as 40% on what we owe the Eurobond, commercial creditors. The bilateral creditors don't want to talk about haircut. I mean, right? So as you've seen there, but this is where the key conversation is going to be going forward. And if you break it down further, I mean, this whole focus on the official creditor committee, where China has been one of the countries giving us a bit of a headache, is bilateral official. Then you also have, it's broken down into this ECA-backed commercial creditors, such as the the cocoa board, they go for the cocoa board to syndicated loan, that will come into play. All that put together, you have the numbers here, 18% of the external debt stock, and then you have 27% of the restructuring parameter that we are looking at. So huge numbers. I don't want to really bore you with much of those nitty-gritties, just to give you a sense of the next big deal. The next big deal, obviously, to talk about the commercial creditors. That's what we need to have a conversation with. And I know that the finance minister and his team will be in London meeting the bondholders, right? They talk to the bondholders locally. That's what we saw with the domestic debt exchange. There's a whole different kettle of fish dealing with this bondholders who hold on to our bonds. They're giving us money, and they're very, very desperate to hold on to what they have and not get a haircut. So these negotiations will be tough. Franklin Templeton and others, as you know, are major investors. They represent private companies, private individuals who are putting money, and they want something back. So we expect this to be tough. But the finance minister wants to also leverage his relationship when he used to be a banker then. As you know, this controversy around Franklin Templeton, he may be leveraging that together as a deal. But then we also have the non-insured, commercial banks in there. But they hold, from what I understand from the sources we've been talking to, these banks don't hold much. A bulk of the amount that we need to negotiate is here with the bondholders. But look at how big that is. 48% of the external debt stock is what we need to be looking at. But then the big question really is, even if the IMF gives us the money that we require, the gap will be there in terms of the balance of payment gap. And remember that we've gone to the IMF fundamentally to get a balance of payment support. And we need to find other means of bridging this gap. So, for example, 2024, the gap will be 2.2 billion, even if we get all that we need. And that's why the debt restructuring, it is absolutely critical. The bulk of it in 2025 is what will come up in 3.2 billion. Whoever wins elections will have to deal with this, right? So the negotiations will be key. It's not only about this year, it's about who wins the elections 2025 and the economy that they meet and what they will have to do when they meet that economy. So again, with expectations against what we get. We were actually expecting 2023 to get some 1.2 billion. That is income, right? We know that the actual disbursement was 600 million. That is the delay we've seen that has entered into 2024. With this deal now struck with the external bilateral, we expect the unlocking of the 600 million, and then the World Bank money and others will come in. So this is good news, right? The finance minister has told us, and you hear that interview exclusively on Thursday on PMX's Business Edition, that with the money coming in, we can expect the projects to resume, right? An election year, that is going to be very important, right? That is going to be absolutely very important. Once the projects resume, you see projects underway in your constituency, and you expect the politicians to go back and say, well, we are doing a lot of work for you in spite of the economic conditions that we are currently facing. But you have this breakdown of what we expect to come. So there is money going to come in, but it's tied, from what we understand, that is money coming directly to the government, right, to use. And the finance has assured you can see projects. Timing is great. You know, the thing I really want to focus on is this graph here. Because we've tended over the years to overspend in election years, right? And if you see the trend here, and this is 2000th election year, we did some 756 billion in terms of what we expend. The expenditure was huge. But come to 2020, and you talk about some 96 billion. That's quite a significant amount of money, right? That we're expecting, because of the IMF disciplining, some 226 million CDs. But this next graph tells us the big picture of the discipline that the finance minister must have this year. Because if you look at the historical trends, in 2012, which is an election year, we're not on that IMF program, and the spending there is what you see, which is some, in the region of some 10 billion. But if you come to 2016, which is an election where the Setekpe was the finance minister at the time, the IMF was in town, so we were largely in check. And 2004 has been celebrated as one of the years where we really kept ourselves in check, although it was an election year. 2016, IMF was in town, we kept ourselves in check. 2020 is a major outlier. See where we are in terms of spending. That gap between there and here is part of the reason why the economy has tanked, right? Because of what we spent in that election year. Now we are facing another election year, the IMF in town wielding the cane over us. We're going to get some money. How do you spend that money responsibly? Not necessarily to propagate an election and to win, but for the good thing, the things that will really help the economy improve. So whoever wins meets an economy. Remember, the former president has said that if he wins, he's expecting to see an economy which is industries, and is asking the labor unions to give him some time. But this question about the election year economy is going to be key, because historically we haven't done well in election years in reining in spending, and 2020 is a classic example of that. When I return from the break, Setekpe will have a conversation with me, and I'm also going to bring in political risk analyst Thue Champon, and then Professor Godfrey Bokwe into the conversation as well on this election year economy, which is ailing, as you know. You have an IMF in town. Is it a good thing that we do? But how do we, looking into crystal ball, what are the prospects? But how do we keep this spending in check so that we don't make an already complex, bad problem worse in 2025, regardless of who wins elections? There's a lot to chew on as we look forward to Friday, when the IMF Executive Board is going to meet. Big day for Ghana indeed, because we're desperate to get that money. We'll not only unlock 600 million, we'll unlock far more than that. The IMF, the World Bank money will also come in. Stay with me as we begin to dissect this after this. By Syntax Tanks, it is strong, it is tough. Alomo Bitters, experience greatness in every moment. Ghana AIDS Commission, Syntax Tank is the tank that I always recommend for you, because it has the double layer tank, and now you can also have as many layers as you want. It is the first to introduce a white inner layer tanks in Ghana with new aspects of what they do, which is bespoke, because you can choose your color, you can choose your size of tank that you require. Also, warranty-wise, they are 7 years, which is one that no other tank offers you in Ghana. So whatever your water consumption, size of project or demand, choose Syntax Tanks. We have agents nationwide. Call them on 0244-335-168 or shop online at syntaxgh.com. Syntax Tank, a strong, a tough. My guest, Dr. Thue Champon, is an economist and a political risk analyst. Also joining me is the Professor Godfrey Bokwe, is an economist and professor of finance at the University of Ghana Business School. And as I've pre-advertised, Professor, he's not professor, he's Setekpe, he's a former finance minister. He joins us for a conversation. And I want to start with him, Mr. Setekpe, for obvious reasons. Talking to you is obviously one, because I like to, because obviously you've been there before. But now I want you to just strip off the economist in you and just talk to me about being a finance minister in an election year under an IMF program, when your government wants to win elections on December 7th. That is your story in 2016. How did you maneuver that? How difficult was it to maneuver that year?
Thank you very much for the opportunity. And let me say that the NDC is proud of its election year record in 2016. And let me attempt to give you, some reasons. In the first place, the decision for the IMF program to overlap the election year was taken by the then president, Mahama, who said he wanted to show that we could continue with our fiscal discipline under the homegrown policy, even under an IMF program. So I think that's one of the things we need to establish. It wasn't something that was imposed. Secondly, you recall that in terms of performance, and I'm not going to go through all the numbers, we achieved zero financing in an election year. It meant that compared to what's happened, where we have been dependent on Bank of Ghana, largely for financing the deficit. In recent times, we achieved zero financing. It was in an election year. And that's because we had other reforms. We had the Treasury Single Account reforms, the gift means reforms, and others that brought, the fiscal resources of the government under the firm control, the government itself, and so banks and others, were not using as much of government resources as was happening previously. But let's also remember that on the new basis, our debt to GDP ratio was 57%. Today it's over 100%. And 56% was within the target B plus ratings target that we had set for ourselves in the homegrown policy, which is 55% to 65%, rating. So we ended the year, and let me emphasize on a new basis, which is what we are using anyway, at 57%. Our deficit was not 10.3 or 8.3, as His Excellency the President himself admitted during a SONA, and the current Minister for Finance admitted. Our deficit was 6.1. And if you took in the discrepancy, it was 5.8 because the discrepancy was positive. This is the best since the Fiscal Responsibility Act passed by this government. It's been the best. And it's very quite close to the 5%. And it was within, the 7% range or so, because we're supposed to be bringing it down, which we achieved, with the under the IMF program.
And Mr.
Let me point to two things, and then
quickly. Because I'm really interested in the personal story, because Ken Ofori-Atta is going to be attempting to do the same under similar, even more challenging circumstances. So I really want to hear how you manage, because the things you said, yes, the evidence shows that you did that in an election year.
Yes,
but I am absolutely certain it wasn't something that was done easily. The demands were there. The demand from labor, even your own party and government for you to spend must have been there. How did you manage and walk that fine line? What were the unique challenges you faced personally? That can be a lesson.
Of course, we had single spine, and we also had Dumso.
Yes.
And then we had, the president, JM decided to just talk to them. Talk to the people who are involved. Instead of borrowing, we were borrowing to be paying the single spine arrears. It was unsustainable. So you had to remember, we did a national presentation, media. I don't know if you were there, to let people know the situation, that it was unsustainable. We also had Dumso, the badge, and other challenges came in. But we had serious challenges. We had done the 2016 budgets in 2015 with a price of $99, right? By the time we're reading the budget, the crude oil prices had slumped to close to $40, and it eventually fell to $35. Remember, we have to be bold and come to Parliament in an election year in March, to trim that budget. We said we're going to do 200 e-schools. President Mahama said it couldn't be done. Otherwise we would be hurting the economy. We trimmed it down to 120. We couldn't do the 120. We did barely 60. Some of the e-schools are now in the bush. We had other things we were doing, like GIFMIS, which was doing the fiscal reforms. Remember, we had done revenue administration reforms and revenue policy reforms, revamped all the tax laws, single window. So putting this on electronic platform. On the expenditure side, yes, we had to introduce electronic warrants. And the electronic warrants were embedded in GIFMIS. And what it meant was simple. Our own ministers will tell you, if you spent above your limit, that's it. You couldn't, overspend. And that's how come we were able to achieve, the deficit numbers that we were doing deep reforms. Remember, right from day one, Professor Mills started with GRA, reform 2009. We merged IRS and VAT in order that we could strengthen domestic tax administration. The customs became customs division. So we had deep revenue and expenditure reforms. But the point I want to make, the point I also want to make is that we came in positive, and the reason I say we are proud. Remember, we left a lot of buffers.
Yeah, okay. Those are facts that we know. But what we don't know is how you personally managed to walk that fine line. Because yes, you talk about John Mahama, but you were the finance minister at the time. I'm curious to know, and there's a story that has been told that said Tekbe was very stingy at the time in terms of your ability to say no, even when the party had come to you. And rumors that people were actually trying to get you out in an election because you were standing in people's way to spend money to win an election. I want to tap into that for a second. What was it like as a finance minister in an election year like this? Because we want to really understand what Ken will be going through in an election year. What was it like for you personally?
I would be lying to you and the public, right, in saying that, I take all the credit if I didn't have the support of the president. And remember, we also had a former deputy minister and a governor as the chairman of the economic management team. Yes, he was quiet. He wouldn't be seen to be talking, but we went to economic management team with a signal. He came to our economic policy coordinating committee meetings. He wasn't obliged to be there. He would be there with us, where we met, and join the discussions and everything. So I would say it's teamwork. Yes. Did I take the brunt of it? Of course, I was in charge of the economic policies. And I hope that some education is coming today. Yes, but it wasn't popular back then. And I know that there has been, quite a blame. But what we're doing was deep structural reforms and fiscal discipline, right? And in addition to the goals, the objectives which we achieved, remember, as I was about to say, we left buffers. Ghana Infrastructure Investment Fund had $250 million US. ESLA is bringing we're bringing about 66 billion by 2026 because we didn't, curtail it. Why haven't we used that, to through the election year to pay down the banking sector debt and others? We left the sinking fund. Remember, it was during the same period that we spent $550 million US in the sinking fund to pay off cash, the first sovereign bond, the one issued by His Excellency President Kufuor. And that's because we wanted. Yeah. If you're going to borrow, as I said, you have to set money aside, election year or no election year. But you can't borrow in an election year, which is going to happen now compared to 2020. So I would say that Evans is not them, but I had support of not support from within, a number of people. Because remember the real sector ministers were also basking in things like Terminal 3, in things like the harbor projects, even some which has just spilled out, the Kosomo Railway Line, the bridge over the Volta. These were all loans which we were able to take. Remember, we were in a fund program. We were able to justify.
That is the question. That's the question I want to put to Professor. That's the question I want to put to Champuthio. Seth says, well, the last time we were in this situation, an election year with an IMF hanging over us and being a headmaster in controlling the economy, in essence, well, we kept within our limit. The deficit was larger than under check. But should he take the credit or IMF does? Because if you take 2016 out of the equation, you have other years of election when the IMF is around that we completely overshoot this, right? We are back in that same situation. The finance minister has been speaking to us and says we're going to keep within our limits. The monies we'll get after Friday, hoping everything goes well, we'll go to the projects that we've already agreed we will use it for. How much of a credit should the IMF take for the 2016 scenario? And what are your expectations this year in terms of keeping the discipline?
Yeah, good evening. Good evening, everyone. So I've been listening to the conversation. In other words, what you're basically saying is that if the IMF is not there, can we not take charge of our own destiny and do the very things that we should be doing? And if you actually look at the evidence, some of which you presented it's quite clear that when we are under a fund program, the numbers begin to improve, and there's some sustenance to that for a year or two afterwards, and then everything sort of goes downhill again, largely because you don't have any headmaster or anybody sort of checking you. I understand where Seth Tekbe is coming from in terms of, okay, at the end of the day, whatever the IMF says, somebody's got to implement it, and there has to be a team to do that and there was some evidence to show that some of the reforms have been implemented. And then even in the current program that we're in, some of the reforms are also still being implemented. But it comes down to really the question of the sustainability of those reforms outweighed an election year or indeed, any other year. And that is where, again, if the IMF is not there, you tend to see major slippages in terms of policy implementation and things like that. I just want to pick on 2 points that have been mentioned in the conversation. One, which is on structural reforms, and then the other one, which is on, call it, fiscal discipline. And you can see that, okay, with or without an IMF, we've been implementing some of these reforms, and you can go back all the way to the mid-1980s, right? And there's some evidence of some of the outcomes of those reforms. But really, it is the question of the discipline, this temptation of our, political class and spenders. And I'm very sure that when Setepe was there, 2016, there was a lot of pressure on him by some of the ministries, to spend. We have to do this road overnight. You have to do this, and sometimes you have to balance some money somewhere to do something and all of that, right? But if you don't have laws and you don't have rules that constrain that sort of spending behavior, it becomes really, really difficult, to be able to do that. Hence why I think really for me, one of the key things that we should be pushing and advocating for by the close of probably this quarter is that passage or amendment of the Fiscal Responsibility Act, right? To make certain provisions much tighter in a way that safeguards any extra budgetary spending that has not been, budgeted for that matter. That would then give any finance minister the room, at least, to say no to some of these pressures. The pressures will come, and it will come especially also when you realize that, look, the economy has been in a nosedive for the better part of about 2 years. Cost of living, inflation, extra taxes, all of that stuff. And suddenly, even major projects have been stalled. Yeah. So there's this pressure now, right, really, for the next 10 or so months to spend. And that pressure is even going to become more exacerbated going into even probably the second and third quarter, of this year. But the way to check that is really some of the amendments that are being proposed under the fund program. And we have to get that to go to Parliament and be done ASAP. Other than that, we'll struggle to be able to contain some of the excesses.
Yeah, I mean, and Professor Bokwing, we've already heard the finance minister looking forward to Friday and beyond, and we're expecting that once Friday's meeting's done at the IMF Executive Board and approvals are given, next week, Wednesday, possibly the 600 million should come in. That's not the only money that will come in. It will unlock others, the World Bank money, etc. The finance minister is already saying the projects that have stalled will commence. Now, bear in mind that this is an election year. You listen to him say that. That is positive, is it? That, of course, the projects are going to restart in earnest because money is going to come in? Or does it leave you worried as an economist knowing our history?
Well, on one hand, it represents positive news, right? So these projects have been earmarked already. There are budget lines and all of that. My concern is the issue of price development and whether the original budget will be able to deliver the same project given inflation and all of that. But I think to the extent that these are ongoing projects that are stalled, we all look forward to their completion. So there shouldn't be so much of a big issue there. But so I'm looking at the data back to 2016.
Yeah.
What happened to off-balance sheet expenditures that were incurred in 2016, right? Which were not in the gift mix and all of that, that were discovered and all of that. I think that not as large as it was reported and all of that, but I think generally, if you look at the macro data in 2016, you could see that part of the progress that had been made in the phase of implementation, the 2016 election year had effect, right, in terms of the program target and all of that. And it was also because of the election year. So yes, it's election year.
So you're saying that in 2016 we still found traces of indiscipline that then became reasons for our inability to meet the targets post the election.
It wasn't as large as the other years without IMF program, but I think that yes, if you look at GDP targets and then actual, if you look at other macro numbers and the rest of them, yes, you can still see some variation in there. And then the rate of fiscal consolidation progress, you can also see slight variation in there. But of course, the IMF being in town also played a role. We can associate that also. But I think broadly, what we should be looking at is whether we have been able to build sufficient fiscal anchors that we can rely on, because we cannot continue to outsource all of this to IMF. We are a sovereign nation and all of that. But I think that those are the things that we need to pay particular attention to. The competitiveness of the election also plays a role, right? Also plays a role. And I believe that how we manage that is also very, very important. Because if you look at what we go through after almost all those competitive elections in restoring fiscal or macroeconomic stability, it becomes then costly for ordinary Ghanaians and then private sector. So I think that's quite important. The other bit that we need to be very careful of is the off-balance sheet expenditures that usually happen, that have to be verified after elections, that translate to arrears and the rest of them. Those are the things that we need to keep an eye on. But in terms of the central budgeting and the rest of them, usually with IMF in town, the monitoring is very strong. So we need to keep an eye on that. The other bit also is that usually the last quarter of the election year, when it comes to enforcing revenue measures and the rest of them, we see some level of weaknesses from there, and therefore your projected revenue tend not to yield the result as we had intended. So those are all issues.
As in the politics, and the politics affects the GRA's ability to be aggressive as they've been in non-election years.
Yes. We've seen that also from the data. Since 1992, we can see that. And then also you also see some contracts that were probably awarded off balance sheets, okay, and to contractors, and then after election, then we have to verify, audit, and all of that. I think part of that also plays out in terms of exaggeration of how we want to make the losing party maybe look too bad, right? And the rest of them. So at the end of the day, all of that doesn't help in the management of expectations and all of that. So we need to keep an eye on that. The other bit also to look at is our target when it comes to inflation and what turns out to be the case, right? You can see the variation in almost all the competitive election years. You see that in there. So when we talk about maybe the fiscal discipline and how it plays out in the overall macroeconomic outcome, we need to improve, right? And all of that works up to budget discipline and the rest of them. And then again, when you look at GDP forecast and then actual, you can also see, and then you can also see a rate of depreciation of the currency, right? In almost all the competitive election years. So you see how all of these things play out and all that compared to probably non-election years, you can see the variation. If you do the econometric analysis and see almost all the major elections years, okay, you look at the fiscal deficit compared to the year before or 2 years before, and after, you again see some level of variation that we need to. So if you look at it over a period, you can say that, yes, you will see some outliers like 2012, right? Like 2020, like 2008, and the rest of course, you rightly mentioned 2004, because of course we're under HIPIC and the multilateral debt relief initiative and all of that. And the other good thing is that the 2004 election wasn't that competitive. The outcome was largely predictable. When it happens that way, the incumbent doesn't overspend to win over the electorates. But if you look at an election that was so close, like 2008, 2012, 2016, of course, with IMF in town, we see that a bit of moderation. But then look at 2020, right? So 2020, even though government blamed it on COVID, it was largely the election issue, right? And that is how come Ghana's fiscal deficit in 2020 probably was the highest in Africa. Maybe Zambia came second or so, and all of that. So all of this, you see how the election plays out.
But let's look at the timing for some of the positives that we've seen in the last 1 week. Now we have a situation where the bilateral creditors have given us this moratorium. So they delayed the loan repayments by an additional 4 years from what we're reading. Now that gives us fiscal space to do a few things, right? We have 4 years to pay, but the first year is an election year. There's a lot of details that needs to be tidied up. What do you expect the space to do for this economy this year?
I think it's just like the way we manage traffic in Ghana, right? So you are heading to Cape Coast, and the traffic is very heavy somewhere, Kasua, and then we put a bridge or overhead over there and move the traffic closer to Budumbrem and Porting and Winneba. So you make some savings, right? Drive fast across Kasua and the rest of them, but you go and meet the traffic further up there. So overall, from here to, let's say, Cape Coast, you wouldn't have made any savings necessarily in terms of how much time you would have spent. So we have just asked for time, but we will pay. I think what this should give us is to have a long-term plan, right? In terms of a fiscal sustainability path, okay, and have more discipline, because at the end of the day, you're going to pay. It's not like it's been cancelled. And remember, Evans, in 2004, where we had debt cancellation, bilateral, and then through HIPIC, and then 2006, when we had the multilateral debt relief initiative. You look at that time and now, how long is that? And we are back to this situation again, right? So it's more about a plan that we want to put in place, right? And then and also the relief that we are getting now. So the fact that we are not paying now, that is available for us. How do we spend it?
Yeah, that's a big question.
What should be the level of, the level of efficiency? And I think we should all be interested. One of the things that I felt we missed out from the domestic debt restructuring was that we actually didn't use it as a bargain to ask for specific reforms, right? So if you look at the fiscal space that was conferred on the state from the domestic debt restructuring from now to 2037, that's over 60 billion cedis. That's fiscal space. How do we use that efficiently in easing the restrictions on the growth drivers of the economy, rather than using it to reward labor and to fund other consumption-based expenditures that overall may not improve the cash flow generation capacity of the economy, right? And then also, how do we use this space? So remember, from December to 2022, because we took advantage of the debt service suspension clause under the G20 Common Framework, Bank of Ghana is sitting on coupons that could have gone to creditors in excess of $2 billion, right? So that is how the relief under the program will be seen. What you should have paid this year, once you defer, what it means that it's available for you to use it this year. But how do you use it? How do you use it to enhance the cash flow generation capacity of the economy, rather than using it to meet the pressures of labor, right, and other consumption-based spending? With that way, then you will not be efficient in how, then you'll be undermining actually the growth potential of the economy and the rest of it. And the other issue we need to also look at, Evans, is that we need to be deliberate about growing a taxable economy, right? So that if you are looking at your tax revenue to GDP ratio, the question is whether you are growing a taxable economy, right? If you are not growing a taxable economy, then the idea is that, yes, your revenue may not scale up as your GDP grows. And that is what we've seen in Ghana, because the reality is that it's not every aspect of GDP and its redistribution that is taxable. We need to be deliberate from that end to make sure that we are able to engineer growth from the labor-intensive subsectors of the economy. Then you also get the direct income tax, right? Then you also get the corporate income tax and the rest of them. Other than that, what we have been doing, right, is to burden the faithful few. The slightest challenges, we go to the same tax-paying population, and just
I mean, and that's a conversation that we've had for quite a while. And I'll bring in Satekbe again onto some of the points you made about the challenges that we saw in 2016. Still, there were some, challenges with discipline, with running of the economy. I'll come there. Seth, I know you want to say something there, but give me a second. Let me bring in Theo. Theo, if you look in the crystal ball for me in terms of the prospects this year, look at how the year has started with the good news that we've heard from what we expect on Friday, the World Bank unlocking of the money, that would also come in. Inflation is trending downwards, in the mid-20s, etc. You look at that, but also look at the fact that it's happening in an election year. It's beginning an election year. And then you listen to the finance minister already talking about what you can expect in terms of the projects coming on board. The same question I was asking earlier. Does that alarm you? Because we're desperate for some good news, right? And it's coming. It's coming in an election year, which could have political benefits for the incumbent party. How they use that political benefit is a big question that we are trying to answer, which Prof is trying to say. What do you use the money for? What do you use the space for? What do you say to that question?
There's some good news, but I sort of worry that maybe it could be too little, too late, right? In terms of what it means politically, and I'll come to that in a moment. But Prof. Bockpin made an important point. I think we also have to highlight on the off-balance sheet expenditures, and one of the avenues for doing this, the state-owned enterprises, right?
Yeah.
So you see a lot of the SOEs in typical election years will be constructing roads, doing all sorts of things that typically you wouldn't capture that through the normal general government budget lines. And it's only after election when we do some of these audits and you hear people are being chased for causing financial loss to the state, etc., before you begin to see that, this is one of the avenues that a lot of the leakages are happening. So we need to pay very, very, very close attention to the spending from many of our SOEs. And then, of course, the point about the savings that have been made from the DDEP and then also from what we're getting from this restructuring and all of that. If there is no clear, deliberate plan to spend in terms of driving your productive capacity, then I can tell you that in this election year, a lot of it is going to go into the consumption things that Prof is talking about. So you will still see your big, large billboards. You will still see the T-shirts and the food and the water and you name it, being distributed.
Even with the IMF in town?
Of course. I mean, these are savings, but you've got no clear mechanism to put them or channel them into productive, sectors in the economy. I'm saying this off the back of what we have seen historically. And nothing so far gives me sort of an assurance or confidence that we're actually going to be able to constrain or restrain some of these spending. And that comes back to the last point you asked about, prospects, right? Yeah. So yes, you will see improvement in terms of some of the growth numbers and some of those growth prospects, but they are only going to stay at your macro level. It's not going to necessarily translate into any sort of improvement at the micro level and productivity gains and you name it. So in the next sort of 3 months, you're getting almost 1.15 billion from the IMF second tranche, 300 from the World Bank, and then another 250 for the Financial Sector Stability Fund. But as we speak currently, ask yourself, has the government even paid its 750 million to start up this fund? I don't know. The last time I checked, it wasn't even there, right? So there are still major gaps. There are still major issues. We've not even talked about the external commercial debt restructuring, because per the government's own analysis and the IMF's own analysis, you are looking at almost getting what that was 4.2 billion close of last year in terms of the financing gap. And you've only gotten about 1.2, if we even assume that the 600 coming now, for accounting purposes, you add it back to last year's number. The 2.5 that you're looking to get from your external creditors hasn't come through. And you need another 2.2 this year from your external commercial creditors, right? So the gap actually is going to be much, much, much bigger in terms of closure. And what that means ordinarily would have been that you have to constrain or cut back on a bit of your spending. But I don't see that happening in an election that is going to be, in my view, one of the most competitive and closely fought, right? So then the argument now begins to go into where are the channels or the pockets that we will see some of these savings and some of these quote unquote spending happening. And one of the things that I think we need to check very, very carefully is through the state-owned enterprises, because those off-balance sheet things, believe you me, when we come 2025 with whatever government that is there and whatever review under the IMF program, you will see a number of state-owned enterprises that have been, caught in that web. And that also then means, that also quickly lastly means that those targets that we have under the IMF program is meant to end 2026. I suspect the program will go into 2027, 2028.
Okay, and which means that your proposal, your suggestion is we're possibly going to miss our targets and create a much bigger challenge for whoever wins 2024, for 2025 going forward to manage.
Yes, on the expenditure side of things.
Yeah.
You will see on growth, inflation, those things, the numbers are beginning to moderate.
Yeah.
But you won't see it improving livelihoods overnight.
Okay.
But you've got a major, issue coming down where basically you've kicked the can down the line. The government that comes in will have to pick up the mess.
Yeah, Prof, very brief in 30 seconds because I need to get Setekwe into the conversation. You agree with that we're most likely missing the targets and extending the IMF program, and whoever wins 2024 is going to face a much bigger challenge with an IMF program with targets off track. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, well, we know that for a fact that, 2/3 of the IMF money would have been spent, by the time the next administration comes.
I'm going to give you the final word, but I wanted to get Prof. Bokwing 30 seconds on that question. Yes. Prof, on that question.
No, I thought I wanted.
Yeah, okay. Just stay with me, Prof. I said, Prof, on that point, is that your prediction too?
Yeah, I agree totally with Dr. Tio Champon. From last year, when the program was approved and we analyzed it, our conclusion was that this program was designed with the extension in mind. Keep that in mind.
But are we meeting our first 3 years targets, considering an election year?
There's real risk that the 2024 may derail the program outcome, and probably to bring it back on track, there's a possibility of an extension. Bear that in mind. Yeah.
Okay. Setekwe.
You see the reality of this in the last quarter of this year. The election really is gathering momentum, and I'm sure Honorable will be coming down very soon and all of that, right? But watch the space. The last 4 months of almost all the competitive election years, nobody manages anything in this country. Ask them.
That's not true.
Yes, sir. Mr. Tekwe?
Yes, I have very little time, I know. Yes, the reality, which we know, is that even in terms of the resources, 2/3 of the money is going to be spent by 2024. Yeah. And so whoever takes over in 2025, and we're going to face that reality, has little money with a lot of structural reforms that are going to happen in 2025. Yeah. Luckily, many of the structural reforms, like GIFMIS and the rest, they have been, the one I'd like to mention is a contract database, the accounts payable, which is in a program. And Prof, that is the basis for the overrun you were talking about. It was not an overrun. We were moving the country to what we call semi-accrual. And the truth is that what we call arrears is counting of arrears that are outstanding. It's the Ministry of Finance at the time of preparing the budget, Controller and Bank of Ghana. It didn't go back to the sector ministries. And so we said, that's what President Mahama calls the pipeline. When you hear him saying, when I come, I'm going to tackle the pipeline. This is the issue of the pipeline. So we created the contract database to take inventory of all contracts that were in the sector ministries with a view to stretching, especially the capital projects, with a view to stretching them over the next 3 years to encumber the medium-term expenditure so that you are not spending when you have a pipeline, you spend on that pipeline. Now, what the government did was that when they came to power, they said we had left a debt of 7 billion, Prof. And I can show you the numbers. We can do it. I'll bring the numbers to studio if you want. They said we left 7 billion. They did an offset of 5 billion and carried forward only 2 billion. Unlike single spine, when we calculated the arrears, spread it over 3 years, and everybody saw visibly what we were. And let me also tell you, Prof, that the same thing has been done. That contract base has been in existence. The fund demanded it in 2021, and the contract pipeline had gone up from 13 billion to 17 billion. Why do I know? I know because we put it in the Public Financial Management Act. But since 2017, it has never been published. And 36 billion of that amount has been added to debt. That is the structural reform that we were implementing. So it was not arrears. The government did an offset. The same thing has been done in 2022. So, and that is why we say that, together with the bailout costs that are put, in appendix and the rest. Now, let me also state that when we get a fund process, traditionally, the fund process do not go entirely into the budget. They went to beef up our balance of payment position. Yes. Remember that the city is struggling. And so this expectation that the money from the fund in particular was going to come was part of the mistake we have been making in recent times. To take money that should go and strengthen, the central bank and put it in the budget, just as we did with the COVID funds, which countries used to strengthen so that is a departure which we should watch. And so I'm skeptical in the sense that, are we going to rely if that money goes, and mind you, the World Bank monies that are going to come are already part, most of it are part of the country strategy.
You say you're skeptical you're skeptical about what exactly? What's your skepticism?
I'm skeptical about the fact that, without, again, and of course the fund is watching, so we cannot do deficit financing. We are going to go and do projects because much of the projects are already in the budget.
You're skeptical that we can execute all the projects. Is that your skepticism?
By the World Bank, the IMF, and yes, they are going to release some money. But in terms of government's own wherewithal, are we going to continue relying on T-bills to finance those? We don't have market access.
Okay. And
this is where it's very important, and we should be careful in classifying the DDEP as savings. It is sacrificed by Ghanaians. Remember, the haircut is sacrifice. I think this notion that, we make savings. You make savings by, haircut, which means that you are depriving Ghanaians of their hard-earned currency which they put in pension funds and mutual funds.
I mean,
if we are going to make any gain, we might as well return the money, to them if it's real gain.
I was saying that.
Excuse me, I wouldn't want to classify it as such, but I'm saying that the market constraints we face, and remember, we are now going to meet
I must say, because of time, that we would have to put a pause on this. After Friday, when the IMF board meets, a decision will be taken. I mean, we expect largely that this will lead to the release of the money. IMF will publish the details of how they came to the conclusions, and of course, by that time we'll also be wiser. Setekpa is going to go to China. There's a lot that we'll learn. We'll return to this conversation.
Absolutely, we should be careful when we get that forgiveness to say that we had made savings.
Yeah, I know. It's a conversation that we'll return to. We'll return to clearly because the economy is going to be key in this election. Enjoy the rest of the evening, people.
Thank you very much.